As usual, we will start with Shift A for our Add menu, add a cube if you don't already have one, tab into Edit mode, and move it up on the Z 1 meter. That simply places our origin point at the bottom. Hit N to bring up the side panel and start typing in the dimensions. Now we want to add our reference images. So let's hit Shift A again, go down to Image and Reference. We'll need to scale down our image and move it around a little bit. Change the depth and side to be front, and change the opacity to somewhere where you can see through it, but still see the details. We'll need to stretch this a little on the Z-axis so that our top edge of the front lines up with the top edge of our cube. We also want to add a top reference. So let's go to Top View and add in another image. Now that we have our reference images in place, we want to start editing our cube. Select it, tab into Edit mode, and hit Ctrl R for Loop Cut. And we'll move this to the edges of the glass cooktop. And our front edge, we want to move back away from the handle. This will not select through by default. You'll see that we only have the top selected. If we go back into top view, select through is always on when you go into wireframe mode. So let's do that and move our edge. Now we have our top divisions done. Let's move on to the front. Hit Ctrl R for loop cut, slide it up, and do the same for the bottom part of the glass. Our main door has some gap at the top and the bottom. So let's select both of these edges that we just added and bevel them just slightly, like that. Now let's move around the side. And we made this loop cut for the top portion, but we need something about halfway. So let's add one more loop. And that looks pretty good. Now we have most of our pieces in place. We can start separating these pieces by selecting faces of the various parts. Once you've selected a portion that needs to be separated, hit P for Separate Selection. Repeat that process for each piece. Now that we've separated the major portions, there are some minor pieces that we need to remove. Back into Edit mode, you can see that these pieces are no longer part of it, and there is a bit of geometry that doesn't need to be there. So these gaps, we can remove these faces by just selecting them and hitting D for delete, or X and select faces. Now our pieces have been separated, but they're still missing geometry. So before we go any further, we want to hide our reference images. We'll bring them back in just a little bit. Select both of the reference images by hitting Shift-click, hit M on the keyboard, and New Collection. We'll call this Ref or References. And let's just turn off that layer for now, or that collection rather. Now let's select one part and hit slash on the numpad for local view. And start filling in edges by selecting two edges and F for fill. In this case, there's an edge loop here that is not required. So Alt-click and Control-X or Control-Delete will dissolve those edges. And we can select this loop and hit F for fill. Tab out of Edit mode, hit slash on the numpad again, and repeat the process for each piece. Now, should you not feel like following this entire tutorial, but would still like to download the finished asset and project file, it will be available in my store with a discount code shown at the end of this video. Now that we have multiple pieces like this, it'll be easier to see which is which by turning on Random Color. Let's bring back our reference collection by hitting the check mark, and let's go into Front View. Select this top control portion and tab into Edit mode. Control R to add yet another loop cut about here, because there's a recess here that we did not model in the first place. So the easiest way to go about this would be to add an edge loop, select these vertices, and delete them. And fill in these sections again, the way we did on the other portions. Now that piece is mostly complete, and we can start putting our knobs in here when we get to that part. Now, there is a portion on the back of our reference image that is a vent. We can tab into edit mode on our major portion here. And first, we're going to add an edge loop here. And it's going to be fairly thin because this part is going to be a piece of glass. So let's remove that before we work on the vent. Now that we have our glass cooktop in place, we can start working on our vent portion. Select the main part, hit tab, and we're going to extrude this primary face just a tad. And grab the two extreme ends, and we're going to bevel this a bit. Use your scroll wheel to change the amount of bevel. Now, our bevel is not looking quite right, and that is because we neglected one thing back when we scaled our primary cube, and that was to apply rotation and scale, or at least apply scale. So what we can do right now is select this, Control A for apply, this is the apply menu, and rotation and scale. We didn't rotate anything yet, but we'll just apply both. We'll go through each piece and do that. Now that scale and rotation is applied on all of these pieces, we can tab back into edit mode on the primary portion. Control B will activate the bevel tool, and the scroll wheel will change the number of cuts in the bevel, or at the edge count. Now we can select this n-gon in front and go into right or left mode. Let's enable the shear tool by pressing Control, Shift, Alt, and S, and X for the x-axis, and that is the x-axis according to your viewport, not necessarily the world coordinates. And we're going to skew that a bit like that, and now this bottom part has come out further than we want, so let's turn on snapping. Shift tab will snap, or this icon, and we're going to move this back on the Y, and now that it's past this point, G, Y, and it will just snap to that edge. Now we have the shape of every one of our pieces. One other bevel that you may want to do, this is really preference on your part, but I believe our reference image has a bevel on these edges as well, on the warming drawer. So let's do that. There are two additional pieces of geometry left to create, and those are the handle and the knobs. In order to create the knobs, we'll select this control portion, go into front view, and tab into edit mode. With this front face selected, hit Shift S to bring up the pie menu for the cursor, and we're going to take the cursor to selected so that it's right here on the surface. Tab out of edit mode, and let's add a circle. We want that circle to face the view rather than the world, and we want 24 sides. And we'll say 0.1, and now we can just scale it the rest of the way. Now that we've done this scaling, hit Control A, rotation and scale, and this will be probably the most complex modeling we'll have to do this entire tutorial. So tab into edit mode, and you'll want to be in edge select mode, select everything, and extrude on the Y axis. That looks good enough, and now we can fill that in with one big n-gon, and we're going to go into front view. We want to use the knife tool to add this portion here that will extrude a little bit. So K enables the knife tool, and it snaps to vertices. So let's start a cut there by clicking, and we want to have a straight line. So press A to align to angles, or rather to snap to angles, and make a click, and click over here, and we're going to right click to, we're not going to exit the knife tool yet, but we're going to be able to make another cut. So let's click up here, and still with angle constraint on, we'll click down there and hit enter to finalize that. Now If we go into vertex selection mode, you'll see that we have that vertex. Control D will dissolve it. And now we want to dissolve this edge. If we do that, Control D, you'll notice this happens. Don't worry, hit F9 or expand your menu down here and uncheck Dissolve Vertices. And there you'll have it just the way it was. So let's select these two faces on top and extrude them on the Z, and their average normal by default is going to be Z, so you don't have to press Z. And we'll select these and extrude as well. Now there's a beveled edge that goes around this rim, so let's select by Alt-clicking the ring and Control B and bring that down to a single face. And this edge with snapping is still turned on, so we're going to take this edge down on the Z and just snap it with one of the ends here. And let's do the same here. This one doesn't matter a whole lot, but consistency. Now let's hit K again to re-enable the knife tool. Click this vertex and hold Shift. And with Shift held down, the cursor is going to snap to the center of any edge it goes across. So let's do that here, and then complete our cut down here. These two edges can be moved up a little bit. And we're going to start connecting our vertices here. Remember to keep all quads whenever possible. That was easy to select to connect these. However, how are we going to do these? Well, what we can do is count our vertices around here that would form quads and make that many cuts on the center. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there are going to be 6 cuts. You can hit 6, and now it wants to slide. Hitting escape will exit the tool and achieve even spacing. So we're going to select one vertex at a time and hit J for join. I want to add one more bevel across the top here. Let's go into edge selection mode and bevel these as well. Now we can get rid of some of these other edges. So let's edge slide, so that is double tapping G. And I want to turn off our snapping because it's kind of distracting. Now that is creating some overlapping geometry, which we're going to deal with in just a moment. So you'll see that our geometry didn't join or anything like that. If this icon were enabled, which is auto merge, they would have simply merged together. But that often has unintended consequences that I've run into. I don't want things merging when they do merge, and so I just keep it off. What we can do is select all vertices, hit your space key or F3, whichever is your search, and search for merge by distance. Now each of these vertices that were on top of each other or very close together have merged together. Now before we move any further, we want to start adding some modifiers that all of these objects are going to use. Let's turn off our reference layer, or collection rather, and select all objects, right click, and hit Shade Smooth. Now they don't look very good, but we're going to fix that momentarily. Select one object, and we're going to add a bevel modifier. That bevel modifier can be set to 1 millimeter, so that's 0.001, and segments are going to be 2 because we're going to be adding a subdivision surface modifier to this. You can add a subdivision surface modifier here, or Control 2 we'll add it as well. Now that those modifiers have been added, we can keep that object selected, hit A for select all, and so this will still remain as the primary selection. Control L will bring up our link data menu, and we want to select modifiers. Now all of the objects have the same modifiers that this object does. Now we want to go through and make sure that our bevel modifier is working correctly on all of our objects. You'll see there's some strange stuff going on here, and we may run into a bevel on this section that we don't necessarily want. And it looks like we do have some issues. But that may be because we have a gaping hole under here from not having closed up the gaps. So let's go into edit mode in local view on that object, and that is correct. We do have a large hole that is causing our shading issues. So let's select this and this, fill them up, and this edge can be deleted as well, and we can fill this. Now everything appears to be looking alright except for that. Now that can be fixed by changing one setting in our bevel, and that is to hit this geometry portion and change the miter outer to arc. So I'm going to get out of local view. Now that everything does appear to be working correctly except for on our knob, our dial, we can easily fix that by selecting this ring, extrude, and scale down. You could also fill it if you want to. Control F and G will give you a grid fill rather than an n-gon, and now that is looking pretty good. So let's come out of local view and bring back our references one more time, because we just want to know where we need to place more of these dials. So let's go into front view. You may already know that Shift D will duplicate an object, but we don't want to do that in this case. In this case, we want to make an instance, which is Alt D. Now, the difference being that this object is identical to this object in every way, meaning that if we were to edit one, they both share the same mesh data. Let's select the dial that we just instanced and add an array modifier. That array modifier is by default set to relative offset. Change that to constant offset and we can set an actual measurement for the distance. Now that we have these in an array, we can add a mirror modifier to get the other side. Now the mirror will automatically mirror along the center of the object, or we can select another object for it to mirror on by selecting this eyedropper and selecting the control panel portion of the oven. Now the last bit of modeling has to do with our vent in the back here. So let's get rid of our references again. In order to add our vents along this back portion here, we want to separate this portion because we don't want the geometry that we're adding here to spider all over the place, and then we have to re-topologize a lot of things, and it's just more work than is necessary. So let's go into face selection mode, control click, and control click is the shortest path between what you have selected and what you're clicking on. And as you can see, we are missing a piece down here because that piece of glass was blocking it. So let's hit P to separate by selection, and that leaves us with some geometry problems on the main portion. So let's go into edit mode there and just fill up that hole. Now we can get rid of this edge loop right here by dissolving it. And we are now done with everything we need to do to that chunk of the range. So let's go back into edit mode now on our vent piece. Start by just filling in the bottom. And now we need to make some cuts here to get rid of this n-gon. So let's go into front view, activate the knife tool, make sure A is selected, and C for cut through. So we'll do the same thing over here. and there it cut the entire way through. Now we are still left with these n-gons on the sides. We can select the center vertex and this vertex and hit J for the join tool, and do that on each of the n-gons that are on the ends here. Again, in this case, these are flat surfaces, so an n-gon isn't going to matter a whole lot, especially once you convert it all to triangles for a game engine or something like that. Now, we have 7 sections to cut in here, and that is actually 6 cuts to make our 7 faces. So use your scroll wheel, click in the center, and hit enter or escape, and now we have our sections here for making our vents. Let's select every 2 faces along here and hit inset, and do the same with these. Now that these are selected, hit Shift R and you'll get the same inset. So let's select all of these now. Hit E for extrude, and we want to extrude along the Y axis to just go back in there. Add a center cut down each of these vents, and select all of those edges that you just added and bevel them. And what this does is it gives our corners a little more geometry to round out with. Now that that is done, there is only one more piece to separate from one of our existing pieces. So let's select the door and turn on our references once more and go to front view. And there are 2 cuts to make. One here at the bottom of the glass and one here at the top of the glass. Now we can come around the side, add a cut here. So we'll grab the middle and the side edges of it, the side faces rather, and separate that. And let's once again fix all the gaping holes that that creates. Great. Now we have our piece of glass separated, but you'll notice there's some wonky shading going on here, and that is because the subdivision surface modifier does not have enough geometry to really work with to make that curve right. So let's put one cut in the middle and bevel that out to about there. Now that looks a whole lot better. Once again, if you see any kind of shading that's not right, chances are the subdivision is trying to stretch over too far of a distance, so you just need to give it some more geometry to work with. So in this case, we might want to do this across the front here as well for the corners, and that's looking actually a lot better. So that is it for modeling. Let's start adding some materials. So let's get rid of our references one last time and go into object mode, and we can see all of our pieces here are looking pretty good. Now, we already created a bunch of materials in our last 2 appliance tutorials, so let's append those here so that we don't have to recreate our materials all over again. To do so, click on File, click on Append, go to the location of a blend file that contains the materials you want, open it up, select Material, and select all of the materials that you want to bring over. In this case, I have 2 that were baked materials that we won't be using here. Click Append, and now all of the materials are in this blend file. If you hit Z and Material Preview, or 2 on the numpad, or this button up here, this will show you the materials that you have placed on your objects. So let's select one of them, go to the Material tab, select this drop down, and select stainless. Now, there are a few other pieces that will use the stainless material as well, so let's select those now, and then shift select the one we already added it to, and Control L. Now we can select materials. Do the same for the rest of the objects. Now we do need to make 3 more materials and modify one that we have here. So the first that we'll be creating is very simple, and that is the glass for the front here. And there are going to be 2 pieces of glass, 2 types of glass on it. So if we bring up another viewport and switch to Shader Editor click New, and this is going to be just dark, probably black or close to it. And we're going to take our roughness down to 0.3 or 0.2 perhaps. We'll see once we get to rendered view what is actually a good glossiness or roughness factor for that. Let's go into front view, bring back our references one more time, and tab into edit mode. We need to add a place for our glass differences to be. So let's add some edges right on there. And these edges are going to need some supporting geometry, because once we add a material to it, it's going to kind of smooth out because of our subdivision modifier. So let's select this face, and over here we're going to add a material slot, and we're going to say New, and this is going to be a very similar material. We'll put that down to black and turn the transmission up all the way, and turn the roughness down to 0.1 or even 0. And you'll see that there's a difference between the two, or you should. The reason we're not seeing a difference is because that material is actually not added. So back in edit mode, select this face, select this material that we just created, and click Assign. You'll notice that the material we just added is not taking up the entire space of the face we assigned it to, and that is because of our sub-D modifier smoothing everything out. So let's add some more geometry. So let's take these 3 loop cuts and bevel them a little bit. And we're going to give them 2 loop cuts, and that should look a lot better. Now we can finally hide those reference images for good, and that is looking pretty good. At this point, you'll notice we did not add the handle yet, so let's tab into edit mode on the front of the door, and we added some geometry that was meant to fix some smoothing issues. However, those smoothing issues didn't actually exist. So I'm going to delete those now, and I'm going to put an edge loop cut across here, and put one down the middle, and bevel that out to encompass the area that our handles are going to come out of, meaning these squares on the left and right. So let's take one of these, duplicate it, and separate that duplicated face. Now it's its own piece. However, the geometry that we created on the door to create that no longer is needed. So we can select these edge loops and dissolve them. Now we can select our handle, go into top view, and we want to extrude it just a bit to about there. And we'll give it another loop cut here, and you'll notice it's already got the material that the object we took it from has. Let's put another loop cut here, and we're going to add some curve to the handle that's going to go across. So we'll move that a little bit on the Y direction, or just edge slide. That looks pretty good. And we're going to select these faces and extrude them. Not too far. And let's see what it's looking like. Let's go into local view so that our view is not obstructed. And this edge is being beveled, and we don't want it to. So what we can do is go over to the bevel modifier and increase that angle until it just bevels the edges we want. And that looks pretty good. Looks like we need to add a loop cut here. And we're going to add one here as well, and bevel that so that there are 3 loops. Move that on the X a little bit. Select this section. There is a seam here between the handle and the pieces that hold the handle. So we're going to hit V for rip. and that is to, you can remember V like it's a zipper, it's ripping the two pieces apart, and hit Control L for all linked pieces, and Shift H to hide all else. What we want to do is take this hidden area that we couldn't see before, fill that in, and inset. Then you can delete that face. We won't be seeing that, but it will give us this bevel that we wanted around the outside. And now, how do you get the rest of that object back? And that's simple, just Alt-H, and everything will be showing up again. And an added benefit there is that when you Alt-H, it automatically selects the inverse. So hit Shift-H again to hide all but that. And there we have our handle. Now, these faces do need to go away. So Alt-H, select these faces and delete them. Now we need to add a mirror modifier. So let's add that now. And move that mirror modifier to the top. It has to occur before the bevel and before the subdivision. Turn on clipping so that when we move this edge to the center, it cannot pass the center. So select your edge ring here and just move it on the X as far as it will go. And that looks pretty good. So there we have our handle. If we come out of local view, we have a pretty complete looking range or stove. And we have one last thing to add a material to, and that is this glass cooktop. For that material, we're going to do a little bit of UV unwrapping. Let's go into edit mode on our cooktop and split up this view with one more panel. One of these panels will turn to a UV editor, and over in our 3D viewport, hit 3 for face selection and select all. U will bring up your UV mapping menu, and we want to simply select Smart UV Project. This will basically decide where to cut up the UVs based on this angle limit. The defaults are okay for this, and you can see how all the faces are laid out here in the UV editor. First thing we want to do is make sure that this icon is enabled. This is the UV sync selection, which means anything we select over here will be selected in the 3D viewport and vice versa. So keep it enabled. Now select the faces that you can see over here, and that will tell us that this area is the UV area for that. And this is our primary selection face, and you can see that here as well. So that actually tells us we want to rotate these -90 degrees. So we'll rotate like in the 3D viewport with R, -90. And we're going to scale those up so that the top encompasses this entire square. Now that we have that roughly sized, we're going to change it some more anyway. Let's go out into object mode and let's create a new material. Call that cooktop. Now find your reference image that you used for the top-down view and drag that into the material editor. Connect color to base color, and you can see already that it's showing up pretty well aligned here. However, it's a little off yet. So go back into object mode, select all faces, and over here you can see exactly what's going on. We just need to scale this down so that it fits within the glass area of the reference image. Now you can see we have a cooktop that is fairly well aligned. Now, one thing that I did off camera that you may have noticed was that I added some support edges on each of the outer edges. That is because without them, these lines get wavy. They kind of wrap around the edge a little too tightly. And then it's always good to just have everything sliced up into roughly squares for the subdivision to work with. Now we need a roughness map, and that is going to come straight from the diffuse map that we're using here, which is just a reference image. Bring that down to roughness straight out of the color socket, and we're going to add a color ramp. If you have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can shift control click on this node to see exactly what it's doing. We want the black areas to be very shiny, and the lines will actually be a lot less shiny, and that doesn't require a whole lot of adjustment. That looks pretty good right there. We don't want to add any kind of bump texture or anything like that, because it is just a piece of glass with this printed pattern on it. So that is it for the cooktop material. Now we just need to make a bit of an adjustment to our stainless material and to our painted metal material back here. Let's start with the painted metal material. Before we make any changes, we want to make a separate material out of this area. So next to the material name, you can see a number. That is how many objects are using that material. Click it, and it becomes its own instance. Now when we modify this material, it is a separate material, not the same one that's being used down here. And really the only change we need to make to this is to remove the normal map. Now we have a very smooth surface, and we need to make it a little shinier. So 0.2 is probably good. 0.2 or 0.3. Find something that looks good. And lastly, we would need to make a change to this stainless material. On the other appliances that it was used, you could not see the top surfaces of any of the stainless. And if you look here, these large exposed areas on top do not have any kind of striation on them. It's just a roughness map on top, and it doesn't have any of this striping. So we can fix that pretty easily as well. In our shader editor, we'll select this entire portion here and hit Shift D for duplicate and move that down. We still want this roughness map to mix in with this striped roughness map on this section as well, so bring that down to this mix node. Now we need a mix node, and this is a mix shader node, not a mix RGB. Drop that here, drop this in the bottom. What we want is for the bottom portion to only show up on the top of the object. And the way we're going to do that is by adding a geometry node and a separate XYZ. We're going to take the normal socket and plug it into this vector, and take the Z socket and plug it into the mix factor socket on the mix shader. Now that achieves the mixing that we need, however we're not seeing any difference yet. And that is because this portion needs to stretch in a different direction than the front and sides. Back in the shader editor, let's make sure that this object socket is also controlling the scale of this mapping node. And rather than scaling on the Z-axis for this, bring that back to 1, and on the Y-axis we'll change that to 400. Now if we come out of here and look at our material, we now have our stripes and roughness on top and bottom, as well as on the sides and front. And that looks like a pretty good final result. Leave a link with your final render in the comments below, or post them on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, and tag BlenderForge. I'd love to see what you create, and I'm always ready to answer any questions you may have. As promised, here's a discount code for the finished asset and project file in my store. A link to that is in the description below. And as always, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, I'm Carl with BlenderForge. Happy blending!